Brave New World welcomes you back to the second session of the day. Those of you who missed our earlier session, Nepal, Unleashing the Vajra with Sujeev Sakya and Ambassador Navteet Sarna in conversation, and all our other sessions featuring speakers including Barkadat, Neil Ferguson, Izzaldeen Abulesh, Homike Baba, Chigozi Obiama, Maya Lunde, and so many. You can watch them on our Facebook page, JLF Lit Fest, or on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. Our official radio partner, Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our next session today is How Can the Sacred Be Sensuous? Vidya Dehejia in conversation with William Dalrymple. In the art of the Islam and Christianity, the sensuous is often seen to be opposed to the sacred, but this is certainly not the case in Hindu art. Vidya Dehejia, one of India's most engaging and distinguished art historians, who has written extensively on the body, love, and sensuality in Indian art, addresses the issue in conversation with William Dalrymple. Vidya Dehejia is Barbara Stoller Miller Professor of Indian and South Asian Art at Columbia University and author of a range of books that include The Body Adorned, Discourse in Early Buddhist Art, and Yogini Cult and Temples. Currently under publication with Princeton University Press is the set of A.W. Mellon lectures she presented at the National Gallery, Washington, D.C., titled The Thief Who Stole My Heart, The Material Life of Sacred Bronzes from Chola, India, 855 to 1280. Her forthcoming book is titled India, a Story Through 100 Objects. William Dalrymple is the best-selling author of In Xanadu, City of Jinns, From the Holy Mountain, Age of Kali, White Mughals, The Last Mughal, 9 Lives, Return of a King, and Kohinoor. His latest best-selling book is The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, which has just recently been acquired by Siddharth Roy Kapoor for adaptation into a series. And of course, Forgotten Masters, Indian Painting for the East India Company. William Dalrymple is also co-founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please do comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest JLF. And in case we drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, how can the sacred be sensuous? Vidya Dehejia in conversation with William Dalrymple.
Vidya, welcome back to the Jaipur Literature Festival. It's been a while since we've had you. One of our favorite speakers.
It's always fun to be there in person, but I guess we all have to adapt to this brave new world of Zoom.
Of all your many books, which are lined up in a great stack behind me, The Body Adorned, is one of my all-time favorites. And in it, you bring to a sort of culmination a theme that's been running through your writing since the very beginning, certainly since that Yogini book, about re-looking at the sensuous in Indian art, which is such a sort of central and spectacular feature of so much of the art of South Asia. And maybe we should start with you giving your PowerPoint, and then we can branch off into discussion and then questions after that.
Well, what I really hope to explore with you, Willie, and of course with the audience, is the fact that the sensuous and the sacred in pre-modern India are not worlds apart in the imagination of that period, that they blend, that they overlap, and that there is a continuum between the sacred and sensuous. And I think the best way is, in fact, to start with a visual so that we're all on the same page. Well, and there's a share screen.
These wonderful pair.
The cover of the book that you pulled out.
I've spent many hours peering through the horrible perspex in the Taj Museum.
Gorgeous, isn't he? He's slender, elegant, this finely toned body, the barest hint of a smile, the way his hair locks have been swept up into a turban of sorts. He's richly adorned, he's poised, he's sensuous. And he's quite divine. And you know that word divine that we use so casually to describe a really gorgeous person. He is divine that way. And also, of course, he is no less than God Shiva. So he is literally and metaphorically divine. You know, the Western tradition has always spoken of God having made man in his own image. I would counter that in the Indian tradition, and this is said without the slightest disrespect, that in the Indian tradition, artists, visual artists, and also verbal artists, as we will see, made God and Goddess in their own image. There is this glorious image of Uma. I'm not going to be speaking so much about her because the female form has been written about so much. And it's always the male form that has been sort of ignored, at least as far as I can see. So, Willie, please, anytime you want to talk about the female form, please do.
I'm feeling a bit disappointed already. Anyway, keep going, keep going.
Well, the point, of course, here is, how does one come to terms with the idea of a sensuous sacred being? Can a god or a goddess who is to be approached with veneration, can they also arouse a passionate adoration? And I think the other point I'd like to bring in here is perhaps even more puzzling phenomenon. Not quite sure why we're not getting to the next slide. Let's see. Slightly more puzzling phenomenon, I think, of divine couples. So here you're seeing Shiva and Parvati, but it also could have been Vishnu and Lakshmi. You see them both seated on the back of the bull, the Nandi bull. And they've been portrayed as a loving couple. Just notice the detail. Shiva has his hand beneath Parvati's chin so that he's asking her to look up so that he can gaze into her eyes. I know that they're partners in a sort of divine marriage, but the sensual nature of the imagery seems to many to be a sort of contradiction in terms almost. But the most important thing I want to say is we are looking at it in three-dimensional sculpture, images that are 4 feet and more in size. The art is in your face, so to say. But the important point is that it permeates the culture of the country. It permeates the literature of the country. And it permeates literature, both sacred literature and courtly literature. And we talk about it as if it was only an artistic phenomenon because all of us look at these images. And there are very few of us who actually sit and examine the literature. But what I would like to do is to show you how this is part and parcel of the entire milieu. I want to quote to you from literary sources which say exactly what these visual images are saying. And these are going to be the hymns of the saints. And you might think that's a bit surprising because would the saints be talking about the sensuous nature of these figures? Yes. We're going to talk about acharyas. We're going to look at courtly literature. And then you might say, well, of course, courtly literature is bound to have references to sensuous figures. And the last set of sort of literary references is going to come from inscriptions, the most surprising source, since inscriptions were usually meant only to record the building of a temple or of a stepwell or of a donor giving money to a temple or to Brahmins. All of these sources point to the fact that one easy way to approach the divine is through reveling in the sheer physical beauty, the bodily beauty of the god and goddess, and adoring that divine body. And those 3 sets of written sources echo actually the visual imagery of the type you're gazing at. And they all propose an open celebration of the deity's enjoyment of love, of marital love, of erotic love. Now, don't get me wrong, because we all know that India has many, many paths to the divine. There's yoga, there's meditation, there's renunciation, you can keep going. But for most people, the easiest path is the path of bhakti. Bhakti, of course, is that intense devotion. It's that personal devotion to a chosen deity. And there are also many strands of bhakti. And one major strand of bhakti, one major path to the divine, is through extolling the sheer physical beauty of the divine. And that, I think, would sort of set the stage to proceed further with your thoughts, with questions, looking at a few more images, and exploring ultimately why it is that it's no longer the same anymore. We can come to that towards the end. What has happened in the modern period? Would you like me to continue?
I'd love you to continue because it's so gorgeous. Just carry. I'm longing to ask questions too, but please carry on because it's perfect.
Are you sure?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it'd be nice to have your intervention. And as
I'm writing down questions and thoughts, but I'm enjoying this so much. I don't want to stop the flow. Particularly some of the wonderful texts that you include in your writing about the erotic and the beautiful.
Well, I could. I'm trying very hard not to go only with Chola images, and so this is an image in the Bhopal Museum that you've been looking at. But we do move to, of course, the
Can't have too much Chola. Keep going on the Cholas, please.
Well, Shiva as the wondrous dancer, and by the way, we did. The introduction did talk about the book that I'm just writing, in which I do not use the word Nataraja because it's just unknown during the Chola period. I'm going to call him the wondrous dancer, Arbuda Kuttar. He's got a dozen names, but Nataraja is something that only enters the vocabulary in the 13th century. But let's call him the wondrous dancer. And just look at him. He is a vision of divinity and sensuousness, which are sort of intermingled into this one single form. There is that exquisite face. There is
the best
that
male bottoms in Indian art.
Absolutely. A gently curved yet tight behind, right? Perfectly
You've always
proportioned.
made a great point about the back views. I remember in your Chola Bronze show in London a decade ago, you made a huge point of all of them being visible 360 degrees and lit 360 degrees. There was no front and no back in that sense, that
Yes.
unlike in many museums where you only see the front.
Yes, museums in India very often, I know, place their images against the rear, and I'm always trying to see if I can get behind that case to have a good look and even take a picture from the back. So you've got this figure that is divine. I mean, this wondrously handsome dancer. His dance is instinct with profound philosophic truth, which I'm not going to get into. I'm going to stay with what the saints did when they were appealing to ordinary human beings, people like us, who were not interested in plunging into the philosophy. They left, the saints of South India left that philosophic explanation to the acharyas, those teachers, scholarly commentators. They left it to them. They were writing just for the ordinary person. And for them, they just talked about the beauty of the form. And here is what Saint Upper who lived somewhere in the late 600s, wrote about this form. He actually says that one wants the opportunity to be reborn once again on earth, as long as you can see the beauty of this form. And it's an extraordinary statement for him to have made, because as we all know, the idea is to stop this cycle of rebirth and not be born again. But if you can see the beauty of this form, then Upper thought it was really worth being born again and again on earth. Here's one of his verses, if I can read it to you.
Please do.
His arched eyebrows, the gentle smile upon his lips of Covey red, his matted locks of reddish hue, the milk-white ash upon his coral form. If one may but see the beauty of his lifted foot of golden glow, then indeed one would wish for human birth upon this earth. It sounds pretty prosaic, doesn't it, in English? And it sounds so much better in Tamil. I mean, English and Tamil are unequal languages. You just cannot capture the music and the cadence of Tamil or of any other language.
When you have a female saint admiring these sculptures, like Andal, you get an even greater layer of eroticism. Andal actually imagines making love to her form of Vishnu.
Absolutely.
Very,
absolutely.
very explicitly.
Yes.
So what's going on there? I mean, it's an adoration which is not just bhakti, but is actually an erotic adoration.
Yes, it's sort of what is generally talked about as bridal mysticism. Very, very
Bridal mysticism.
Yes.
Lovely.
Very complex. I mean, the phrase is beautiful because it seems to express both this eroticism, but also hinting at the fact that it is a mystical way of thinking about it. But there is bridal mysticism, and I will have an opportunity to quote to you one of these types of poems, in which it's not bridal mysticism, but it's when the physicality of the yearning and of the love is brought out much more. This one is just the beauty of the form. But I mean, do you want to hear it in Tamil?
I'd love to hear it in Tamil.
It's short. So we start with the eyebrows. Kunitha puruvamum, kovvai shevvayil kumin shirippum, panitha shadayum, pavalam pol meniyil paal venneerum, inithamudaya yedutha pon paadamum, kanapetral, manida piraviye venduvade inda maanilatte. That lifted foot of golden glow, that foot is the one that actually confers blessings and salvation on the devotee. And so it is always that lifted foot that becomes the sort of focus of any poem on dancing Shiva. And by the way, I mean, I don't know whether you remember the fact that Rabindranath Tagore and what he said about reading Bengali poetry in English translation. He said that it gives about as much satisfaction as making love through the services of an intermediary. And that intermediary is the language
also quoted Nehru about eating rice with a knife and fork. I've heard the same image.
Oh, well. Let's look at one more divine image, which is extremely popular in South India. And so I have you once again with...
Also in Tanjore today, in the Tanjore Museum.
Yes, in the Tanjore Museum today. And another image like the one we started with, which belongs a little after the year 1000. So we're talking about the whole 1,000 years ago. And this is the form of the begging Lord. That's what he's called. Pichadevar. Bhikshatana in Sanskrit.
Irresistible mendicant.
Yes, the irresistible mendicant. Absolutely irresistible. And, okay, so you can see that the artist has done something fantastic with it. And you will be impressed by it. You may be a little shocked by it sometimes. But what I want to say is that this is exactly the same that you find in the poems of the saints. And sometimes the saints, instead of actually describing the figure itself, they focused on the effect that the figure had on the viewer, which is another extraordinary way of describing his beauty in a manner of speaking. So here is this irresistible mendicant, this enchanting mendicant who is roaming the earth with alms bowl in hand. His lower left hand has that alms bowl. He's got a serpent knotted around him to serve as his loincloth, they say. But the saints made fun of that too. They said, you think you've got the serpent as your loincloth, but the serpent has a mind of his own and has completely revealed you. But the sculptor has modeled a figure that, he's this vision of a bodily manifestation in which Shiva stole the hearts of all the women who came to give him alms. So what happens? He goes from home to home with his alms bowl, begging for food. Now, the women of each of these homes to which he goes are aware of the very incongruous nature of his beauty, and yet they are completely enamored of him. And it's interesting that the saints, when they wrote about this form, always had their poems are always placed in the mouth of the women who are coming to give alms to Shiva, to this extraordinarily sensuous form of Shiva. And here is just one verse from many, many similar verses. This one was written by a saint named Sundarar around the year 800. And the woman addresses Shiva saying, "What strange attire is this of yours? The music of the Tamil tongue adorns your speech. The while the serpent dances on your hand, we bring you alms, but how to give it to you when your serpent hisses? Pray tell us, handsome one of the forests, you of pineally where fragrant groves abound, does not the radiance of your form mock the glory of the setting sun?" Each verse is from a different woman, a different house to which Shiva is going, where he comes to give alms. And some poets express the passionate longing for physical contact with this form of Shiva. And I'd like to read you one of these. You would like to hear it, in which one woman is talking to her companion who's standing beside her. And here's what she says, referring to this sensuous form, saying, "Listen, my friend, yesterday in broad daylight, I'm sure I saw that Holy One. As he gazed at me, my garments slipped. I stood entranced. I brought him alms, but nowhere did I see that cunning one. If I see him again, I shall press my body against his body and never let him go, that wanderer who lives in Uttriyur." It's really quite extraordinary, isn't it? How the sensuous nature of that God, the longing for passionate, in this case, union with him, admiring the beauty of that figure is important. It is crucial. It is the path to the divine. You reach the divine just through the beauty of the Lord.
Are these your translations out of interest? Because they're things of great gorgeousness in themselves.
Many of them are. Most of the ones I've read are. But there are some wonderful translations by Indira Peterson, under the title Poems to Shiva, which are quite spectacular too.
And Ramanujan, of course, what wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Except that, unfortunately, because he passed so early, we have such a small corpus of poems translated by him. It's sort of, very sad.
They're things of such beauty, Red Earth and Pouring Rain, and those early ones, Songs of Love and War.
Yes, absolutely.
Vidya, a couple of questions. We open this in a sense by framing this as something very different from the Western tradition. And it is, of course, very, very different from Christianity. But it's not so dissimilar from the sculpture of ancient Rome. And indeed, the earliest of the beautiful male bodies that you get in Indian art, in Gandhara, has a very close relationship with the form of Apollo.
Yes, so we have the gods of Olympus in Greek art and in Roman art, obviously. And they had a very, they did have this similar sort of approach to the divine. It was never phrased, it was beautiful, but it was never phrased in quite this way. We don't have this huge corpus of hymns and writing and poetry. We do have beautiful figures, both divine and human. And there's an interesting point here about those Roman and Greek figures, because those who've studied them carefully, and in the Greek and Roman context, it's possible because of burial, which isn't, in India you have cremation, so there's no skeletal remains that you can study quite that way. But they have pointed out that it is an ideal body. And this, of course, is obvious with the Indian representations, that it is an idealized body. It's not the body of, this is not the body of life classes necessarily. It is that ideal form that is being presented there. This is that idealized body. And what is all this about? It's about the fact that in the imagination of pre-modern India, spiritual beauty had to go hand in hand with physical beauty. You could not have spiritual beauty without being accompanied by physical beauty. The two blended, melded, they automatically went together.
And this is almost as true of Buddhism as it is of Hinduism, isn't it?
It is very much true of Buddhism, although I think physically in the form, and even in the poetry, it's expressed maybe much more in the Hindu context, but it's very much a Buddhist idea. I mean, about the Buddha and describing his body, there's a whole text that describes various items of the Buddha's body, like he has a lion-like form, has hands which are very long, he has a voice, beautiful voice, and all of these, the text tells us,
bull-like.
He got them. Why? Because of a good deed that he did in his previous life. Each of those is attributes to a good deed, so that this good living and spirituality meant a beautiful body as well.
And the Buddhas even more so, Maitreya, when you get the Maitreya with his jewelry, he's a prince, those sort of fantastically muscular Pashtun sort of figures that you get in the Gandhara art.
Yes, yeah. It is that beautiful body, which is there in the Indian tradition and was very much there in the Greek and Roman tradition, maybe expressed slightly differently or not expressed quite so openly and even outrageously as in the Indian context by the poets and saints.
And why when you go to someone like Ajanta and you look at those murals, now you're in a Buddhist monastery, you're with a bunch of men who've taken a vow of celibacy, and yet there you get again this sort of astonishing eroticism. You get these almost naked bodies of the court women, women on swings, women in pleasure gardens. Again, I mean, with Hinduism, in a sense, and bhakti, one can understand that it's a passionate devotion to a god. But what's going on when you've got nearly naked women in a Buddhist monastery for celibate men?
It is an interesting point, is it not? That the stories that are told at Ajanta, so it's not necessarily, it's not the Buddha himself, but his consort Maya, when you see her as, even when she's giving birth, in the birth scene of the Buddha, which is of course that miraculous birth where she leaps out of the hip,
the rib,
yeah. And isn't born in any vaginal manner. It is extraordinary how much emphasis is placed on beauty. And then you have to go back to the fact that the courts at which this was written, these poems were written, this whole concept came about, was a Hindu court. It was a court that the Buddha left and said, I am proposing a much simpler path towards salvation, a path that does not need all the ritual that he was sort of objecting to the ritual path, but the physicality of the body. The Buddha's body has to be a beautiful body, like every other body, whether it's that of a king. So, you know, when you're describing a king, and it's love. Love is central and the beauty of the body is central. And so when you describe Vijayalaya Chola, the founder of the Chola dynasty, he captures the town of Tanjore. When he captures the town of Tanjore, the description in the inscription is that he takes the city of Tanjore by the hand as he would take his wife by the hand. So that there is this extraordinary imagination that is going on at that time with these various figures.
Again, with Buddhism, when you go to somewhere like the Kala caves, and you're arriving at a Buddhist monastery for celibate men, outside you've got this sort of Bollywood scene of dancing girls and literally dancing figures, not just figures of fecundity and fertility, but actual dancing figures. I mean, it is very much like a sort of Kuch Kuch Hota Hai poster or something when you arrive. And, why? What's being conveyed?
The importance, there are two points here. One, that woman on her own, when you see her on her own, as an emblem of fertility, and fertility never had always wonderful connotations of abundance and prosperity and plenty. And so these figures were the figures that were auspicious. I hate the word auspicious. It's so clumsy as a word. But if you say Shubha or Mangala or something like that, words that are used constantly, all the time, this is a fortunate time, this is an auspicious moment, a Shubha moment or a Mangala moment, woman and the couple become signs of anything that's Mangala or Shubha. And so that automatically had to be represented on any monument. And it would bring fortune. So if it was on a Buddhist monastery, it would probably bring lots of visitors to the site who would donate towards the monument. If it was on the palace of a king, it would bring success to the king. If it was on a temple, it would bring success to the temple. So that apart from the purely sensuous divine, there is also just the sensuous figure itself that brings, that is Shubha and Mangala.
Just like in modern advertising.
Yes. I wanted to bring in a divine couple and spend a few minutes with it. I'm not sure if we have lost the share screen. I'm just going to see if it comes back.
The images back. Here
Yes.
we go.
Okay, let's see. Yes, okay, good. I think we could use this to talk around the idea of the couple. So here's the divine couple. In this case, as you can see, it's Shiva and Parvati. And their intimacy is being celebrated in this visual. If you look more closely, you can see that Shiva has one hand, one of his left hands around the breast of the goddess. He has cupped it in his hand, and Parvati's hand is around Shiva's shoulder and neck. And I'd like to read you a couple of things from Inscriptions. Now, inscriptions of all things, aren't inscriptions supposed to be sort of pretty boring records of grants of land and grants of money to Brahmins, to a temple? They often proclaim the construction of a temple itself. They give the genealogy of the donor. What has been overlooked with every inscription is that inscriptions always commence with a verse in praise of a deity. And these verses, starting verses of an inscription, usually very often use overtly sensual language to describe the activities of the figures, the bodily beauty, but also the actual amorous interaction of the figures. So let me read you the Ratnapur stone inscription of the year 1163. This is in central India. It records the construction of a Shiva temple and various other shrines and stepwells by a feudatory prince. And here's the verse with which it commences. Notice Shiva, of course, as you know, has a third eye in his forehead. And it's referring to that third eye. And this is how the entire very long inscription starts with this verse. May the divine half-moon crested Shiva increase your welfare. He who has three eyes, as if because of his desire to see simultaneously, at the time of playful, amorous enjoyment, the pair of golden pitcher-like breasts and the lotus face of Parvati, daughter of the mountain. Isn't that an extraordinary conceit to conjure up something like that as a reason for Shiva's third eye?
This segues very well into the first question. We've got some very good questions here. And the first one from Om Prakash Parikh says, why is it always Shiva and Parvati who are portrayed as the sensuous couple? Why do we get so much less of Vishnu and Lakshmi in these sensuous poses?
We do actually have quite a lot of images of, unfortunately, I have not put one in here, but you will be able to see several in that book. And I am going to read you one, which is from Kannauj, so from northern India, from the Gadwala rulers of Kannauj, which between about 1000 and 1200, they were ruling in the area of Kannauj, and all of their inscriptions start with the same verse, which is very interesting. And so for the moment, you're going to have to try and imagine that there's a conch shell and a discus, and that this is Lakshmi. So this is what it says. May Lakshmi's hand, which is caressing the neck of Vishnu, here is the hand, as you can see, I don't think I can point it out, but the hand is very much on his neck. May that hand grant you happiness. And it's, if I read the whole thing, which I won't, it says, may Lakshmi's hand, which is caressing in the course of an impassioned sexual act, the neck of Vishnu, whose ardor is undiminished, may that hand grant you happiness. So it is there very much in the case of Vishnu and Lakshmi as well. And what I need to say to you is that these inscriptions are actually telling you why such images and why such pieces of poetry were created. It's telling you, here's one image in which we hear, and if I can quickly find it again, may Shiva, who experienced the delight of an embrace from Parvati, multiply your excessive delight. What it's saying is that creating a poem about it, a verse, or creating an image and giving it to a temple is asking for that same bliss, that same marital bliss. And for heaven's sake, who wouldn't want the same marital bliss of Shiva and Uma? So putting this image on that is a devotee's offering. Think of it like puja and prasada. So when we go for puja to a temple, when a Hindu goes for puja to a temple, they take with them a tray of offerings, maybe flowers, maybe coconuts, maybe bananas. It's offered to the deity who blesses it, partakes of it, so-called, and then the priest gives you back a portion of that to take with you. So think of this in terms of that type of offering. Here it is divine bliss in the form either of a poem or of a image like this that has been presented to the temple. And it has been accepted by the temple, and Shiva and Parvati or Vishnu and Lakshmi have blessed it. And in return, they can't cut off a portion of the sculpture and give it to you, but they are going to grant you that same blessed bliss, that marital bliss. And I think if we start thinking of it in those terms, then the fact that this is from Orissa, I could show you images like this. I earlier showed you one from central India, from the Bhopal region. There are multiple images, whether it's in west or east or west or north or south, in the Himalayas, in the deep south, they're everywhere, which points just to the importance given to the bliss of marriage. That in the Indian context, you weren't supposed to, yes, there is salvation that you're going to aim for, but it's a progressive series of steps. You don't bypass any of them. You don't go from the student stage to abandoning the world and becoming a mendicant or a forest mendicant or a forest resident. You do go through the marital stage. You experience the bliss of a married life before you then go further. Only a few real saints and sages. For the common person, it was a step, and the marital step is important. You know, it's strange.
With the adoration of Krishna, it's often extramarital.
You will notice I didn't speak about Krishna because so much has been written on it, and he's such an obvious figure to talk about when you talk about this type of subject. But I wanted to focus on Shiva because Shiva is usually never considered in this manner. This writing of love poetry to Shiva is it's quite extraordinary, and it's there. It's just that it has never been emphasized in that particular manner.
We have an interesting question here from Sachdev saying, did this tradition, were the sacred and sensuous always connected throughout the various periods of Indian history? The Mauryan age, Rajput, Vijayanagara, is it a constant? Yes, it's pretty much of a constant right from, say, the 2nd century BC, when we start seeing imagery and poetry, up to about the 18th century. Or so, even the early 19th century. Of course, there is the Islamic rule, and there is Christian rule, or it isn't Christian rule, it's British rule, which moved away from this mingling of sacred and sensuous, in which the sacred and sensuous were two separate things. It's not that either Islam or the British tried to impose that idea. It's just that the whole culture was surrounded either by Islamic rule, which had a very different idea, or by British rule, which also had this very different idea. And so it has resulted in a modern nation in which the last 300, sometimes the last 500 years, depending on where you lived, you were surrounded by cultures that believed that the sacred was one and the sensuous was another. And so that has sort of
in its own way, entered into the upbringing and the ethos and thinking of many Indians of today. So it's this age in which the sensuous and sacred intermingled is sort of, for many people, a distant past. I know we are surrounded by temples and images, but they don't relate to it in quite the same way that they relate to, say, British rule or to Islamic rule. So it's also, there's
very
actually,
specifically the Victorians who were particularly, much more than most Islamic rulers, much more than 18th century British. The Victorians had this particularly hard line on sensuality and this very complicated attitude to the body.
yes.
And that sadly got passed on into some of the Victorian forms of Hinduism. You get this, everyone suddenly being covered up in late Victorian Hindu art.
Absolutely. It is quite extraordinary. There's another point when we talk about people today and their response. In the day and age when this image, for instance, was created, the only way you could see it was to actually make a trip to the site of the temple at which it was. There was no reproduction of images in those days. Today we are inundated visually. You open your internet, your computer, and you're inundated with images. And we have to think of an age of relative innocence, in which these images had a powerful impact on the devotees who went to see them at temples, or on the people who had an opportunity to go to a Buddhist monastery and see that these images are important, or to a king's palace and see the same sort of images on it. And we are so, in a way, spoiled by this overabundance of imagery.
Very interesting question that's come up here, related exactly to that, about how far were the Chola bronzes deliberately built to be seen in a temple, or how much were they a thing for processions and public viewing?
Well, they were definitely intended for processions.
That's Ramakrishna's question.
And you could see them in a temple, but you would see them in the temple on the side, beside the shrine, but on the side, with still remnants of the flowers and the adornment and the clothing. It was the priest who could see them in all their beauty, because he was the one who bathed and adorned them and dressed them. But most people would see them only as sort of like a float in a procession, when they were in fact so covered with garlands and actual gold and jewelry that you could almost not see the image. So it's very, very true that would have influenced the imagery. But at the same time, if you walked around the same temple, on the walls of the temple, like what you see here, there are all over the Chola temples, there are images of many standing, a few seated images of Shiva and Uma. Uma, as Parvati is called in the south, with the same thing, with Shiva's hand cupping the breast of Uma, and Uma's hand on his shoulder, around his neck. So you had both. So the bronzes would have been seen largely in a worship context, but the same type of images would be on the outside of, say, the great temple at Tanjavur, where you've got images of Shiva and Uma in exactly this sort. They are standing images on that temple, but they have the breast cupped with one hand. So you have
or the permanent stone sculpture on the side of the temple, where you have
on the side of the temple. So you have both there.
The problem is, today, if you go to a temple, you have them either under worship when they're all dressed up and you can't really see anything except the faces, or they're in those sort of cages in the side ambulatories where you can't get close to them. Is that a modern thing because of their value and the fact they might get stolen? Or were they kept fairly inaccessibly when they were out of worship? But
no, they were even 35 years ago or so, when I first started working with South Indian temples, they were in the open. Open meaning they were in the hall on the side of the shrine, but they were not barred. You could walk up to them, you could touch them, nobody minded. The trouble is that the sacred art became as much of a commodity, unfortunately. And not only in the West, in India as well. I mean, look at the number of museums. But it became a commodity. And then, of course, there's always the problem of smuggling. So that is the reason why they are behind the double and triple bars that you see nowadays. But the sad thing,
like
of course,
zoo animals locked away behind bars, so many of them. One peers through, longing to catch a glimpse.
I'm afraid so. And also, a lot of temple bronzes have been put into icon centers, which are completely closed to the public. They are completely closed to the devotee. So neither the devotee nor the art lover can actually look at them, but they are supposedly being preserved for posterity, except that they could catch bronze disease, and there is such thing as bronze disease, and it is extraordinary that the simplest way to avoid bronze disease is to wash them with water and to air them, which is exactly what happens in a temple. You may first pour milk and coconut water and everything, but you then pour water on them, and then you take them out in a procession and they get air. And that is why they have actually survived. That is all that's needed to preserve bronzes.
Vidya, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I would love to chat for hours and hours about all this and see yet more wonderful slides and hear more fabulous readings of your translations. But we're going to have to save it up for when you come back with your new book to Jaipur.
Okay, let's hope we see each other, all of you who are listening, in person in Jaipur.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vidya, and thank you, William, and thank you for those beautiful photographs. And for those of you who are interested in seeing more of them, they're in, of course, Vidya's new books and in the books that she's already done, and hopefully you will be able to
a great masterpiece
of them. And the Chola bronzes, remember, are in Chennai in the museum there. Of course, you have to get a guy to come and open the lock, and he'll come on a cycle, and it's all dusty. But it's an incredible collection that they have in the museum. So go out there and have a look. Thank you all for
watching.
More
Tanjavur, the fantastic palace museum. Yeah. The first two images we saw today.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you to our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. And please do remember to log in on Wednesday, the 1st of July, for another set of great sessions, starting with Vikram Chandra, the sacred and the profane, in conversation with Devapriya Roy. And this is at 7 p.m. IST, 2:30 p.m. British Standard Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And the second session on Wednesday, the 1st of July, is the Sari, Malika Varma Kashyap and Mukulika Banerjee in conversation, introduced by Rita Chisti Kapoor. That's at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Summer Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Stay safe, enjoy the weekend. See you on Wednesday.